technology.
It's always a feeling of triumph when I get to those points.
Yes. The best is when you let everybody into the Zoom room and like it all of a sudden loads with like, you know, all the people and you're like, oh God, it worked.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to go over to the Calvary Facebook and so I can share this on my page. Let's see here. Maybe I can. Okay, great. And we're here. Well, if you're just joining us, my name is Amber Carswell. I am an associate rector here at Calvary Episcopal Church in downtown Memphis, Tennessee. Glad and grateful to see Elianna Yolkut across, it would be across the table, but now what's the right metaphor? In the Hollywood Square directly above mine in here. And really so glad to have you here, Elianna. All the way from
so glad to be here.
All the way from Washington, D.C. So that means you didn't have to navigate the 6 inches of snow that we're going to be getting.
Oh, yeah, we have ice. We had about 1.5 inches of ice yesterday. So my car was, I had to like de-ice. It was like I was on an airplane working in an airport, like de-icing my car this morning.
I had a friend who couldn't get in to her vehicle because we got ice a few days back.
Yeah.
So like blow dry it. Apparently you can use a blow dryer to.
Yeah, it was, I couldn't get any of the doors open except for the driver's side door at first. So I did that. And then I turned all the heat on in the car and then eventually everything defrosted.
Well, it's so unusual here, right?
Yeah, you don't get snow usually, right?
You do not get snow. So everyone is in full freak out mode. 6 inches today, and they just changed the forecast to 6 more inches, or an overnight into tomorrow, 6 inches. And then another 6 inches on Wednesday, which is Ash Wednesday, happily. So we're just gonna see what happens.
Well, that's an unexpected snowfall.
Yeah, it's nuts. Yeah. So Elianna is a rabbi out in Washington, D.C. She is she serves part-time at, Addis?
Yeah, Addis, yep, exactly.
Addis Israel Congregation as the rabbi in residence of lifelong learning. And you're a community rabbi, right? You see this as your responsibility to get out there and teach Torah and develop commitment to the Torah and the study of Jewish texts. And the reason I know you is because back in seminary, you were one of my professors at Virginia Theological Seminary, and you taught me, you were the one who introduced me to the concept of midrash, actually.
Yeah, one of the best gigs I've ever had.
Oh, it was one of the best classes I ever had in seminary. And that's, I mean, I say that not as flattery, but like as a, like, I have just a whole, just a number of classes at seminary, right? Like I was really there because I loved the Bible. And I loved its concepts and everything that I had to learn in those pages. And so scripture classes were certainly my favorite, and I had amazing professors in that. And Midrash was this whole different entrance into the exploration of these texts, which engaged my imagination, my mind in ways that I just hadn't expected. And it was a real gift.
Yeah, I think seminarians are like really great for rabbis because they're very polite and respectful, and the Jewish community is sort of founded on the principle of questioning and challenging. And so oftentimes when you're a rabbi and you teach in Jewish community, there's a lot of like, which is fabulous. Like there's a lot of pushback on what you're presenting, and seminarians were very like just really respectful in this way that I had never really experienced. I taught rabbinical students and other rabbis and obviously the Jewish community at large, and wonderful, but like very different culture, I think, in Jewish and Christian communities, which we could talk about at some point also. But I think like I was just so, it was such a pleasant experience, and having to teach something like a way in which to look at scripture that is fundamentally very different, I think, than most Christian denominations. Midrash is its own very important to sort of the development of Jewish identity and the Jewish community, but it views text very differently than most Christian scholars do. And so I think like just the intersection of those things was so interesting for me.
It is. And, you know, when I, this past year, I actually took a online Zoom course over one of the books that you gave me in seminary, which was the Reading the Book by Vysotsky. And so we went through chapter by chapter with this group of folks who were learning about this Jewish way of interacting with a text and with each other, and the arguments that you could have, and the sort of multivalent layers of interpretation and rightness or wrong, and like, and how those terms mean something different. And what was really helpful was we went from that into we're in Galatians right now, which is a letter from Paul, who was a Jewish man. And he sound, you know, whenever anybody reads Galatians, it's his angriest letter. He disagrees vehemently with what's happening, and he doesn't make any apologies about disagreeing with it. And the way he uses scripture to make his points is very much in this line of what we had just read in this book. Of we're not looking for literal meanings. We're looking for these connections and how we make our arguments out of the text that way.
Yeah, I think that's like the misunderstanding for many decades, really centuries, between in Christianity and Judaism, was that Judaism somehow gave birth to Christianity. And instead, it's really that biblical Judaism gave birth to two different ways in which to engage in the world religiously. One was the Pauline way, like Paul and the apostles, and the other was the rabbi's way. And they developed at the exact same time. So there's so much more like sibling religions. And it's literally like what happens at a funeral sometimes. I don't know if this happens to you as a clergy person, but you go to the funeral and like one sibling presents one story about a parent and the other sibling presents another story about a parent. And if you didn't know better, that they were born of the same parents and grew up in the same family, you would say to yourself, like, how did that come out like that? Like, how did this parent be like was perceived in so fundamentally different ways? And I think like in a certain sense, that's like a really good metaphor for how Christians and Jews, and I would call us the Jewish community of modernity, the inheritors of the rabbinic tradition. So like how rabbinic Judaism and Pauline Christianity developed at the exact same time and fundamentally interpreted text in different ways, saw theology in different ways, and all of that. And it makes us much more like siblings than anything else. And I think like, for me, that's like a core principle of how I see the way in which Christians and Jews can interact, relate, study together, all of that, because we can inform each other in terms of like different ways of seeing it. So when I hear you talk like that, it makes sense to me, like, because Paul, of course, was at the same time as the rabbinic imagination, Midrash, the Talmud, all of the books of the rabbis were developing at the exact same time that Paul and the apostles were also living and figuring out what their Christianity would look like. And I think like it's heart. It's like heart. I don't want to sound like kitschy, but it feels heartwarming to me because it feels like that moment at the cemetery where like you are the rabbi, you've sat with these people and you know they just had fundamentally different worldviews and experiences of this parent, and like neither of them are right or wrong. They're just fundamentally their experience. That's sacred because it's theirs, and true because it's theirs, lowercase true, that the capital T true doesn't exactly exist in that realm. And I see it that way very much. And it's why I feel like I learn a lot from Christian view of text and Christian view of prayer and all of it. Like for me, it's so much about being siblings with each other in all of the ways that can be really wonderful, and also all of the ways that can be really challenging. And I know that's not our topic for today, but since you said it.
What are those land yaps is what we call them in the South, the like this little extra bonus that you get when you're
I never heard that word, land yaps.
Land yap, it's some sort of French or Creole origin, LAGNIAPPE.
Oh, I never heard that. I love that. I'm going to look it up after this.
So our topic here today, what we had you had spoken about, you presenting on today, was the Book of Esther, which is, of course, one of the books from the Hebrew Scriptures, what the Christians might call the Old Testament. But you've got some interesting things to say, and that I'm really interested to hear about how Esther might be speaking to our lives in a different way.
Yeah.
The pandemic.
So I think, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be in Memphis. Memphis, right? It's Memphis proper, right? Where you are?
proper
Yeah.
downtown.
So I'm so thrilled to be able to be there with, I guess, without having to get on a plane, though maybe when this is all over, I don't know when that will be, but I'll be able to actually come and see the church and be in person. But the interesting thing about the Book of Esther, which, as you noted, appears in the sort of the Hebrew Bible is divided into 3 sections in the Jewish canon: the Torah, which are the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then the books of the prophets, which span Joshua all the way through Ezra and Nehemiah, which we call in Hebrew Ezra and Nehemiah, which are the latest prophetic works that we have. And then there's this section called Ketuvim, the book of writings, which contains many things: the book of Psalms, the book of Job, a number, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, a number of what we would sort of call the sort of more extra books. They don't exactly fit into other categories. And Esther is contained in there. Esther is considered a scroll. In other words, when it has been found, it was found in a scroll fashion. But what's interesting about it historically, which might be helpful in understanding the frame that I'm going to give it today, and I'm going to give you a broad overview of this story. I'm going to give you a historical context. I'm going to give you a broad overview, and then I'm going to do a little analysis of what I think it's saying to the modern reader of the Bible. It's a very late book, the Book of Esther. It's dated approximately in the late 5th century BCE, which is in the last few books that we have that were canonized. It's considered in the Jewish canon the last thing to be canonized. In other words, everything else was already in the canon. There was this debate about whether Esther should come in or not. And it got
is because there's no God in there, right?
Right. Well, it's interesting So what's interesting, I'm going to even take that a step further than just that there's no God. I'm going to make it even more radical than that. But what's interesting about it is, so of course, or maybe not of course, but in the mid 20th century, around 1950, between 47 and 56, there was this huge discovery in the land of Israel in a place called Qumran, which is in what is in an area called the West Bank, which some of your listeners and participants here might know about. It was called they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls colloquially. And they were found in caves, fragments. And what was found in the cave were fragments of every single book of the Hebrew Bible, except for the Book of Esther. The group that was living there was likely a group called the Essenes, and they were likely part of the Sadducean. When the Jews they were divided into Pharisees and Sadducees, which I know Christian audiences know a fair amount about. The people that lived in Qumran were Essenes. They were likely of the line of the Sadducees, but they were a specific sect of Jews or Israelites.
Separatists, right? Like,
yes, they were separatists, exactly. And we found there every fragment. If you go to Israel, you can see this actually in the Israel Museum, what's called the Israel Museum website, where many of the Dead Sea Scrolls are found, where you can see them in person. They actually have a fantastic website where you can access all sorts of information about this. But the Book of Esther is the only book in the entire Hebrew Bible, from the Book of Genesis all the way to the Book of Chronicles, that does not exist there. There's no fragment. There was no parchment. There was no scroll. There was no nothing. And it gives you a sense of the radical nature, because one of two things happened. Either we haven't found it yet because they're still digging there because they still might find it, or the Essenes were so separatist that the Book of Esther was so radical for them that they didn't actually want to have it. So they kept it out even though it was canonized. They kept it out of their tradition even though it was canonized. So here are some things about it that are really, really radical. And I'm going to give you this overview of the things that I think are radical. And then I just want to make sure you know what happens in the story, because the story itself is very important.
Sure.
It's a 10-chapter book. It's really 9 chapters plus 3 verses. Many scholars think that 10th chapter probably had more verses that got cut at some point, because there's no other chapter in the Bible that's that short. It's only 3 verses, the 10th chapter. Yeah. So it's very rare that a chapter in the Bible would be, especially in the Old Testament or what we call the Hebrew Bible, would be that short. So many scholars think either those 3 verses should be tacked back onto 9, or there was probably a missing fragment. But regardless, it's a very brief book.
Yeah.
But here are the things that are really radical about it. So, Amber, you said no God. It's not just no God. It's no religion at all. In other words, both the language in the Hebrew, both the Hebrew language is not religious in nature. It's very different Hebrew. It's very late. The Hebrew is very different than other books of the Bible. It's even different than some of the other later books like Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah. These books have very unique Hebrew because their Hebrew is more modern rather than biblical. But Esther in and of itself is like vastly different even than them. And I'll give you an example. The best example, the easiest, quickest example, because I'm sensitive to the time, is that the word da'at, which in Hebrew means religion, is used a number of times in the Book of Esther, but it does not mean religion in the Book of Esther. It means governance. It means the government. So substituted for religion is government. And I think what you're getting there is a hint at the notion that the Book of Esther is dealing with questions of power and authority, And specifically, and here's the second piece, besides there being no religion and no God, that's unique about the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther is the only book in the Hebrew Bible that takes place in exile, that is in diaspora from Israel, with zero interest in return. In other words, you all probably know that there are many prophetic works that take place in the exile. Jeremiah, Ezekiel was during a time of exile, but they all speak of a longing to return to Jerusalem, right? Eventually, what the prophet is calling the people to return to is return to the good ways so that you can enter the land again, so that you can return. God will not be angry with when you are. You will be rewarded with victory militarily, and you'll be able to go back into the land of Israel. That's ultimately the message of most prophetic works that happen in exile. This is the only book in exile. There's no mention of the land of Israel, and there's no interest in the land of Israel. And I'll take it even further. At this period in the late 5th century, or the middle 5th century, which is when we think it actually takes place, even though it gets written in the late 5th century, this was during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And during this time, the relations with the king that was ruling the empire in Israel was that Jews were allowed to come back. In other words, the Persian people, the people that were living in Persia who were Jewish, could have returned at that time, and they chose not to. Some scholars have called this a meshed diaspora. That is to say, it's the beginning of the triumph of the idea, the earliest form of the idea that you can be fully Jewish in a diasporic community. You do not need to return to the land of Israel. Or arguably, if you don't want to argue it that far, that it's a laboratory for that. Is it possible, the Bible might be asking, to live in a diaspora safely, forever, never looking towards Zion as a return, never going back to Israel at all? Maybe in the Messianic era, because our Messiah is going to come and bring us back. That's ultimately what the Jewish view of the Messiah is, but certainly not in this life. These people could have gone back, and they chose not to. So those are two things: the religious and lack of religion or God in the book, the enmeshed diasporic idea that there is no return to the land of Israel, the unique Hebrew style of the book, its satirical nature. Most scholars, Christian and Jewish and others, understand this book as a book of entertainment. It's supposed to be it's supposed to be funny, a satire, or scary, depending, but funny and scary are kind of, there's a fine line between the two of them.
It's so
there's no other
outrageously scary, right?
Yes, and there's no other book in the Hebrew Bible that is like that. There's no other book in the Hebrew Bible that is like that. No book has the satirical nature in this way. And then the last thing, which is very, very radical, and I think arguably the most radical, even though the no God feels very radical to the rabbis and they try to find God in there, is the gender roles. Mm-hmm. This is the only book of the Bible that we think possibly could have been authored by a woman. We don't know who the authorship was. We know when it was dated based on the Hebrew language and some of the idioms that are used, but we don't know in the middle of the 5th century who it was. But we do know that Esther, the queen who becomes the heroine of the story, we're told in the book itself, we don't know if she wrote this scroll, but she wrote this story down. And that's what the book tells us. The notion of a female heroine at all, I mean, while the matriarchs certainly play an important role, while there are women that figure prominently, the prophetess Deborah in the book of Samuel, there are certain women that are prominent. Nobody gets the play that she does. She gets a whole book named after her. She is more than Mordecai, who is a prominent figure in this story. She gets play beyond any woman, and her role is very powerful. She makes
every Jew ever, right?
Yes, she makes her way into the palace. Yeah. She uniquely hides her Jewish identity at first at the behest of Mordecai. She reveals it in a very calculated and very cautious way, but which becomes very successful for what she wants. The book itself, the story itself, raises a number of notions, like philosophically and theologically, that I would argue are very radical and challenging to the typical way in which at least Jews see the world. One, of course, is the diasporic idea. Most Jews would tell you, ultimately the goal is Judaism really wants us to return to the land of Israel. Esther presents a totally different reality. It says, like, the project of the diaspora is actually to make Judaism safe, even when the world is not. The notion that you can achieve power, authority without God in your life. I mean, that notion is like, it's so radical, like no other book in the Bible even comes close to saying such a thing. Which is why the rabbis try to sneak God in there. The notion that the entire notion of the book is based on one idea, and that is the idea of reversals. So the first 5 chapters deal with the story, the first chapter opens with no Jews. That's also weird for the Bible. After the section on Noah, the section on Noah in the early stages of Genesis, from the time that Abraham enters the scene in chapter 12 of Genesis, Jews feature prominently in the Bible, like in the Hebrew Bible. They're in every chapter of every book in some way, shape, or form. Esther opens in the first chapter. There's no mention of Jews at all. It doesn't even seem like it's a book about being Jewish. And only in the second chapter, when we get introduced to Esther and Mordecai, who are clearly assimilated Jews. They don't practice Judaism in the way that we think of Jews in the Bible. Their names are Esther and Mordecai, likely after Ishtar and Marduk, who are gods that are not the gods of the Israelites.
The Babylonians.
So the whole notion of them as Jews is radical because they're not like any other Jews in the Bible. And what happens is, unlike many biblical books are a chiastic structure, A, B, B, A, they're bookended by two A's, or A, B, A, B. That's almost always how all the books go. You start off with one narrative, you get to a second, and you usually keep going on that, and then you bookend with the first, with the prophecy of the first. The Book of Esther is a pyramid. Chapters 1 through 5 are the narrative that we're being told. We're in a Persian empire. There is a king who essentially is a buffoon. His name is Ahasuerus. He needs his advisors. He does nothing without asking his advisors what to do. He literally doesn't make a decision without them. Everything from banishing his first queen because she's disobedient to what Haman wants to do to the Jews, which is genocidal murder. Everything is about his assistants. He's like a puppet for everybody else. You get introduced to this idea. You get introduced to anti-Semitism when in chapter 3, Haman basically says, I hate the Jews and I want to kill them, and pays Ahasuerus in order to do that. The whole idea of it's the trope of it, if you look there in chapter 3, is very typical anti-Semitism, hatred of the Jews. They're scattered, they act differently, they don't follow your laws.
So and that's then, different too. Like, I mean, because it seems like other places are so like when you read anti-Semitic tendencies or whatever in the warring of the tribes, right? The like nations want to move in on Israel, but just a sense of like, oh, there are Jews living around us, and that's what we don't like.
The only other place that you find that in the Bible is with Pharaoh in Egypt.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
In other words, Pharaoh is the first person to first call the people a nation. In the Hebrew, the word is Am, Ayin Mem, and it means nation. It's the first time Jews are referred to in that way, as if they're a unified people. And Pharaoh's description in Exodus is very similar to what Haman says. Pharaoh says the people are fruitful and they multiply and they scatter basically like vermin. It's that earliest form of anti-Semitism that gets used all the way, of course, into the 20th century with Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini during World War II. Described pictures in Germany are very much like, it's weird because I don't know that Hitler was aware of it, but like very connected to that biblical thing. But you don't get it a lot. Pharaoh is basically the only one that does it. Everything else is not really anti-Semitic. It's, as you noted, warring tribes or nations without that language. But here, Haman, there's no reason. He basically just says they're scattered out throughout this large kingdom that you have, and I hate them. We need to get rid of them. They're not good for you. That's what he says to Ahasuerus. So that builds up, and then we get to 4, where we get the entrance of Mordecai saying to Esther, okay, now you have to reveal yourself. Now you're in the palace. This is the moment. And if you look at 4:13 through 17, it's a crucial passage where Esther she basically takes hold of her own destiny, and she says, okay, I'm going to reveal myself. I'm going to do this. And then she does something that no other woman in the Bible does. She enacts a fast day, what we call a holiday, a fast day for all the Jewish people. Again, really radical notion that a woman, I mean, our whole calendar is based on male people. They determine the calendar. The rabbis were all men. And they wrote the calendar for us, our liturgical calendar, what we read, what holidays we celebrate based on the Bible. And all of a sudden you have this woman enacting a 3-day fast day, and later on is going to enact the holiday that we read this scroll on, the holiday of Purim, which is coming in about a week and a half in the Jewish calendar. And then you get chapter 5, where she begins to lubricate Ahasuerus to get what she wants. She comes up with this really great scheme. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, she's very intentional in what she's doing, very smart, very cunning in a good way to save the people. And eventually in 5, she doesn't say anything yet. And then in the pyramid scheme, 6 is the top of the pyramid. And 6 is the moment where everything is reversed, where instead of Mordecai being hung on the gallows because he doesn't bow down to Haman and Ahasuerus, Haman is hung on the gallows that he built for Mordecai, and Mordecai is paraded through the community as a hero because he reads in the book Achashverosh that Mordechai had saved him from an attempted coup. Everything gets switched. Haman becomes defeated and arguably killed unjustly. He never goes through a trial. That's a whole nother part of this. Like, is this story part of the story supposed to tell us that when we're in exile, no matter what we do, injustice is always going to follow us, even if it's our enemy who experiences that injustice, that Haman and the people who suffered at the hands of the Jews who won victory and then killed many, many Persians, is the notion of this book that when you're living in the diasporic community, or maybe the notion is when you're living without God, the notion of justice is very tentative, that you have no chance to go have a court system because it's on the whim. Everything's on the whim of the king or the whim of those who are in power. And the entire book is really, I think, in a certain sense, and I know you probably want to ask questions and other people may want to ask questions too. The entire book, I think, in a certain sense, is a question mark. In other words, its historicity is a question mark. Like, did this story ever happen? Its presence in the Bible is a question. Why is this in here? Why is this in the Bible at all? The notion of it's not being in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a question mark. And I think the biggest question mark of all is the Book of Esther saying to us, life is fundamentally uncertain. We have absolutely no control. In other words, all the time, things are going to be happening to us and to our communities that are really scary and problematic. Mm-hmm. And what do we do with that? Like, it, as a book, its argument is not, it's the opposite of the book of laments, like the books of Psalms or Lamentations, or even the prophetic works where, in the language of the psalmist, from the narrow straits, I called out to you and asked you for expanse. You call out to God in the moments of narrowness. This is a whole different articulation. This is like, the world is going to be very difficult. You are going to face things in diaspora and exile that you cannot even imagine. You are not going to feel God's presence. God is going to be absent in your mind or in your heart or in your soul. And the question is, are you going to rise up and embrace your power like Esther? Mm-hmm. Or are you going to allow yourself to be subsumed by the danger? And I think in a certain sense, it offers an alternative to the moments in existence and in the world where we seek out God as our salvation. And in this way, it's very rabbinic because the rabbis were very interested in the human-divine partnership, even though it's not written by the rabbis. It's very much in their line, which is you cannot depend on God alone. The notion in Judaism that you can depend on God alone is antithetical to everything Judaism believes. God is there, but we are partners of God in creation. And as a consequence of that reality, we have to depend on ourselves also. Doesn't mean you get rid of prayer, calling out to God. It doesn't mean you get rid of faith, but faith is juxtaposed to action. And the nature of those two as a team, I think really the place where you find that the most is in the Book of Esther. There is no God to save you, Esther. That's what Mordechai says to her. Nobody's coming except for you. Like, you're it. You have to embrace your power. And the language he uses there in chapter 4, which I think is just worth saying aloud, because I think it's just, he says—
well, it's a question itself, right? Like your idea about the—
do not imagine, yes, exactly, to escape all of the Jews in the house of the king. For if you indeed remain silent, relief and rescue will come to the Jews from elsewhere. Some people think he's hinting at God there. I don't think that, but that's for another conversation. And you and your father's house will perish. And this is the line that I think is, in a certain sense, a clarion call for all humanity. And who knows whether for just a time like this, you have attained royalty. And sometimes I think the Book of Esther could be pinned on that. Like, if you have to pin it, like you pin a picture on Zoom, that's the pin. The pin is in the moment when your world is coming crashing down. Maybe you're the person that's supposed to rise up and embrace your royalty, embrace your power, embrace your holiness to make a difference in the world. And I think in this past year, certainly, like, political upheaval, economic upheaval, pandemic, I think all of us of faith, all people of faith, have asked the question, like, where is God in all of this? Where is my role in all of this? And I think the Book of Esther actually offers a really radical, but for me at least, a notion that I want to embrace, which is that my faith in God is crucial. It's at the center of who I am as a person of practice and faith. And yet there is something good in the subversiveness that it's not, you can't only depend on God. You have to also depend on yourself and your community of people to look at the world and say, this, whatever it is, this systematic racism, this economic insecurity and injustice where people are suffering and only a very small number of people are prospering. That is not the world that I believe in as a Christian or as a Jew or as a person of faith. This idea that the pandemic, for instance, is hitting women much harder than it's hitting men in terms of both economic insecurity and also just mental health issues. The notion that that we live in a political system now that's completely divided and we can't even talk to each other ever about anything. All of it's pushed us all, I think, to this very narrow place where it feels like almost every day like you can't breathe. And I think Esther says to you, like, maybe this was your moment. Like maybe this is it. In this narrow place, you were supposed to be the voice of justice, the voice of hope, the voice of possibility, the voice of overcoming injustice. And that is why I think, like, for this moment in time, there could be nothing better than like a deep dive into the Book of Esther, which I've been spending a lot of time with, because I think it offers a really different vision than the other books of the Bible, all of which are wonderful. And I love also to study like you do, but also like this gives us a little different, I think, sacredness to hold on to. So that's sort of like in a little bit more than 15 minutes, sorry, like an overview. So that now like ask me whatever you want to ask me or comment or disagree or anything.
Well, it strikes me that, that Esther, the conversation about Esther's inclusion in the canon mirrors something of what happened in the Protestant world with Martin Luther, where there was a specific book of the New Testament that's called James. And the problem with James, for someone like Martin Luther, who had this great revelation of grace, is that James says your works matter. And if you don't have works that go along with your religion, then your faith means nothing at all. He hated it and would have done anything to leave this book out, and yet it stayed. What strikes me about the parallel here, though, is that there seems to be more of a theological divide between, James and maybe the rest of the Christian letters and the pastoral letters, whereas Esther, it's kind of like it's almost like the Song of Songs, right? This is a little too sexy, like this is a little too licentious. Yes. Esther's power in here, she's the most powerless person in this little world, right? Yes. She's a woman and she's a Jew.
And she's in the harem, which made her even more powerless, right? Like the harem wasn't how the harem operated in those days. Was like, it wasn't like things were good for them. They were like set aside in a separate room, and the king called them whenever he wanted them once a month. And otherwise, they were just hanging out there alone, away from their families. They weren't allowed to leave the palace. They lived this incredibly isolated. She was so powerless in every possible way. She says that to Mordecai, by the way. She says to him, "Are you crazy? If I try to talk to the king without being called, he's going to kill me." Right. That's what he says. And in the end of her speech, where she agrees after that passage that I read, she says, so I'm going to do this. And if I come to the king and against this rule, if I'm disobedient, if I perish, I perish. That's the language in the Hebrew. If I die, I die. Like I'm willing to die for this, which might happen. So she's like totally powerless. It's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yet the only thing really at her command in this is her sense of, like, she's cunning, as you said, but it's her like sexual allure that moves this story around that people are very uncomfortable with as a sort of mode of power. And yet this is a theme that does come up a number of times. I think Yael uses it too in Kings when she kills Sisera. Remember there, she brings him into her tent, and the idiom that's used in the Hebrew seems to mean that they had sex with each other, and she kills him with the tent peg when he's asleep afterwards. Oh yeah, I say Jael or
Yael. Yeah, sorry, Yael in Hebrew. I should have said Jael, yes, because it's in the J in the translation, but it's Yael in Hebrew, and like that notion, and I love that because for me, like, the idea of, I think, like, maybe in this way, I'm like not a feminist of the previous generation, but like of this generation, which is like, I think like if society is going to pigeonhole you as simply about your gender, like it's simply about your biological sex, simply about what you look like embrace that and just use it. And that's what Esther does. But by the way, that makes it even also radical. Forget even the like sexual nature of it, but like it's not lying exactly, but like it feels almost a-religious or not religious in nature. And what I'm trying to argue, and I really do believe, at least in Judaism, is that Judaism is saying in this moment, at least in this lens of the world, is like that embracing your power against injustice is religious, even if it means you do things that aren't normally considered religious.
Yeah,
And I think
like moral boundary is fuzzy.
yes, and I think and I think that there's something very compelling about that, particularly in difficult moments. I don't think she gives up her morality, but I do think it asks us to ask that question, which is like, what happens at the end? Is Haman's murder, is that justice? Like, is that the way we really want to live without a court case and without actually trying him? It made me think a lot about after World War II, the main Nazi that was caught, the biggest Nazi that was caught was Adolf Eichmann. And Adolf Eichmann, who was the right-hand man to Hitler, one of the right-hand men to Hitler, he was tried in Israel. It was a very radical idea, right?
They
a lot of people thought
Brazil or something.
What?
Was he the one who had run to Brazil and they picked him up?
No, he wasn't. That was another guy, but yes. Or maybe they did find him in Brazil. I don't remember where they found him, but he was brought to Israel. And when he was brought to Israel, he was tried. It was very radical. There was a lot of questions about like, what is justice in this case? And I think some of what Esther's asking us is, what is it just for Haman to be killed? And then the Jews killed, we're told they were defending themselves is what we were told in the book, but they killed many thousands of people. And there's like this question of, is this really the story that we want to be telling? What's ironic about it for Jews is that in our liturgical calendar, when the holiday is established rabbinically, and the holiday is called Purim, which means lots, because that's what happens. The lot gets pulled. That's the day that Jews get. And instead of it being a day that we're going to be killed, it becomes a day of our holiday, of our celebrating. It became a pediatric holiday, like kids and dressing up, and it has a carnival aspect because it's
like Halloweenish. Yeah.
Yes, it has that aspect. And the notion of it as a childlike holiday is really crazy because it's the least child-friendly holiday that we have. It's about a genocidal maniac who tries to kill us at the hands of the most powerful king in a gigantic empire, and somebody risking their life to save them, and then killing the bad guy, and then killing many, many Persians. And there's a lot of sex in it, or sexual undertones in it. Like there's nothing about it that's pediatric, but it became this pediatric holiday, which is a shame because, to be honest, like the Book of Esther is really fantastic for adults. It raises all sorts of great issues to grapple with, and we lost a lot of that in our calendar because it became like this kiddie friendly. We literally had carnivals and before COVID, and kids dressed up, and it's very much not a kid holiday. The story is for adults. It's about what it means, I think, in a certain sense, to be an adult in a world that feels upside down. What do you do when you face an upside down world as a person of faith? How do you engage with that? Do you lament? Do you call out to God? Do you pray, or do you act? And it gives a different answer, I think, than the rest of the Bible. And I think it's, for Jews at least, it's an answer that gets held up along with the answer that the psalmist gives, for example, or Isaiah gives, or that there's a tandem thing happening for Jews. Maybe like James, maybe like the Book of James in that way.
Well, yeah, and that like Lamentations, right, has a way of talking about the absence of God as the focus of the story. So it's, the absence of God is being commented on. And so we've got all of these experiences of what God is like through these different tales in the Bible of, this is a God who saves, and this is a God who's absent, and this is a God worth praising, and this, and that Esther isn't even commenting on, I don't know. It seems like it's not even commenting on God's absence.
No, I don't think so. The rabbis in the Midrash, just because you mentioned Midrash earlier, and in the Talmud, they try to come up with God in this story. They try to find God in this story, right? Who is Mordecai referring to when he says they're going to be saved no matter what you do? Mm-hmm. Must be God. What does the name Esther mean? It comes from the Hebrew Hester Panim, God's hiddenness. It's the same root, they say. It's likely not. It's likely a Persian root that comes from the word Ishtar, but they make that up. They interpret it that way. And then they connect it to a verse in Deuteronomy where it says, I'm going to hide my face from you. You're not going to, and they say, oh, that God is referring in that Deuteronomy passage to what's going to happen in the Book of Esther. But I think it's a stretch. I mean, I think they're doing it because they're radical. They're very shocked by the book. They have to find a way to make it religious in nature because otherwise it really pushes against a lot of what they were trying to say. which is, the God of Egypt, right? The God with the outstretched arm. The rabbis love that God, Yad Chazaka in the Hebrew, the strong hand and the outstretched arm. That God who comes to be your salvation in Egypt is the God that they want to embrace. I mean, we have 70 names for God in Hebrew, like at least. And so they embrace every kind of God, but they don't love that God is not in here. They really struggle with how to reconcile that for themselves. Whereas I find it incredibly compelling, because I think the notion that we're always going to feel God is disingenuous to the human experience. Like, the nature of the human experience is sometimes God's presence feels very powerful and present, and other times it doesn't, at least for most humans that I know. And I've sat by many hospital beds, and I'm sure you have. And for some people, there's a really powerful moment where there's a real strong presence of God. And for other people and other moments, there's like, where is God in all this? Like, I was a person of faith. I did what I was supposed to do. Why? The ultimate question, right? Like, why is this happening to me? And I think Esther actually says something interesting about that. She says, like, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, why has this not happened to me yet? Like, why have I not embraced my power in this moment of narrowness? Why have I not figured out what I'm going to do to live a religious life, even when I don't feel God's presence? That's actually, for me, at least, when I read this as a reader of the Bible, and as a person of faith, I ask myself, like, how do I be Jewish, live Jewishly, when I don't feel God all the time? How do I do that? How do I wrestle with that idea? And that's a notion that Judaism is very comfortable in. Like, the notion of wrestling with God is that the famous Jacob story, of course, in Genesis, which is where we get our name. Like, it's very part of like our DNA, if you will. Like, it's that, and Esther represents that to me. She's the ultimate story of that, because I don't know what she believed. We don't have any evidence that she practiced Judaism. She was, again, likely assimilated, and yet she feels this connection to the Jewish community, is so much so that she's willing to risk her own life to save them.
Yeah.
So there was something about her that connected her to something bigger than herself, and I think, like, ultimately that's like a really powerful question for people.
Right, that's like, right, like, it's more that her actions did reflect something of what her faith meant to her, or her religion.
Definitely. Yeah.
Right, rather than her preaching,
No, definitely.
That it was this, she was willing to pay this ultimate price for apparently something she believed, that we don't get into the inner life. And we're a people that are so concerned with people's consciousness, right? Your inner sort of personal consciousness, that we're very uncomfortable with not, I don't know, we want to explore Esther psychologically, but it's her actions that are moving the story along, and that are heroic, that don't need any further explanation for her.
No, and I think, like, she's opposite of the prophets, in other words, in that way. Like, the prophets were all guided by this deep faith, which often, by the way, made them not very well liked in their time, right? Isaiah was hated, Ezekiel, people thought Jeremiah, they thought they were crazy, and they really did. Like, they didn't listen to them. And she doesn't seem interested in that. We don't have any indication that she is. She's just this person who gets her hands on power and access to power, and she uses it to be a savior, a salvation for the people that she's connected to in some way. We have no sense of her inner life, no sense of why she feels connected to Jews. We're not told, they were celebrating holidays together, they were coming together to worship at a temple. Then, I mean, we don't have any of that. Like, there's no notion of that in the book.
No temple. Like, man, I mean, because it even strikes me that, and this is sort of irrelevant, I guess, but like, that even the books that aren't looking back on the promised land are looking forward to the promised land.
Definitely. They all are, except for Esther.
It's all, in some way commenting on the land, except for Esther.
Definitely. Definitely. Right. Think about the psalmist by the waters of Babylon, right? They're sitting there by the waters in this suffering. And what are they doing? They're looking towards Zion. That's ultimately where they're trying to go. I mean, there's a million examples like that. Like, everybody is like that, even in the exile, except for her community. Her community is, and I think it for Jews, at least, it's radical, that notion. In other words, most Jews have grown up with the idea that ultimately every community in diaspora was always trying to get back. And I always say this to my congregants, like, I I am interested. I love Israel. I consider myself a Zionist. I've been to Israel. I spent a lot of time there. I want my kids to be fluent in Hebrew. Like, that's important to me. The state of Israel is very important to me. And yet, like, I'm not interested in Israeli Judaism. I'm on the project of diasporic Judaism. Like, I'm a rabbi living in the diaspora, trying to make Jewish life rich and deep here. And Esther is the ultimate for me in that. Like, she is ultimately about that. Like, what it means to live in the diaspora, embrace the uncertainty of the diaspora, embrace a world that is upside down. Right after Haman makes his edict, it says, the line in the book is, and the city of Shushan was confounded. And there's a lot of scholarship around the fact that, like, in a society that is so turn of the dime, like everything's going fine, minorities seem to be doing fine in this Persian Empire, and then all of a sudden the Jews are going to be genocidally murdered, and everybody around is confounded by that. They don't know what to do, because the regular Shushanite person who was living in the Persian Empire probably had no idea that this was going on in the palace, that this genocidal, homicidal maniac. And I think in a certain sense, that's the question. Like, when you're living in the diaspora and you know that your place in the diaspora is uncertain and it is not a homeland, you do not have power, you do not have authority, what do you do with that? And that, I think, is like a fantastic question for all people, not just for Jews. You know, when you look around and the world is upside down, what do you do? How do you live as a person of faith? Like, what are your actions that reflect that faith in the world? And I think we could all use a little work on that. None of us are I don't think we've been very successful at that. Look at all the injustice that we have. Look at all the unfair treatment. Look at all the, we're incapable of having conversations with each other. Like, we can't barely even talk to each other about anything of substance because, you know, I don't think we know how to live the way that she did, which is to embrace our royalty. And I know we have to stop, so.
Well, yeah, no, we do, but I wish we didn't. I wish we took another hour about this. We've had a lot of comments of folks talking, you know, kind of exploring what it means to have intellect and discernment together, right? This rational and the spiritual self. And I think what's, you know, maybe what I'm walking away from with this is the times when my faith has felt most fragile, or that God felt most absent, or I was most unsure of what steps to take in life. It was this shift of question from certainty into the question mark, as you said, right? Yeah. Like, if I believed this, how would I act? If I wanted to be this kind of person, what would my actions do to reflect that? And it was almost like that turned it from action instead of, you know, as Luther said, you know, this like understanding for him of the revelation of faith meant works meant nothing. But for me, it was very, very different to turn that into, like, if my works are such that it's reflecting something that I want to be, then eventually that will become me, and it will have a difference.
Yeah. Can I say one more thing before we conclude?
Yeah, please.
So the holiday that we have that got instituted based on the scroll itself in the 9th and 10th chapter is that there are 4 mitzvot, 4 commandments. The mitzvot are commandments that we fulfill. We believe there are 613 of them, and there are 4 for this holiday. 3 make a lot of sense, and the 4th does not. And I think that's actually fundamentally the message. So the 4 mitzvot, the 4 commandments that we do on the day, the 25-hour day of Purim, on this holiday where we mark the Book of Esther, we read it twice. So one is we read it twice, actually read it at night, and then again in the morning. We read the entire scroll. We chant it actually with a special tune out of an actual scroll. We give gifts to our friends. So we like send packages. We roam the neighborhoods. I don't know what's going to be with COVID, but we roam the neighborhoods and we deliver, you know, treats and bottles of wine and other things that people like to celebrate with. And we have a festive meal, which is very classic for Jews. We love to eat when bad things are about to happen to us and then they don't. That's like our classic joke that we like to say. It's not that funny, but you know, Jews think it's funny. But the 4th one,
so much that like you can't tell the difference between Mordecai is good or Mordecai.
Yeah. So part of the meal is the drinking, which is it's called a mishteh party, which comes from the Hebrew word shoteh, which means to drink in Hebrew. And so the idea is that you're supposed to drink, and there's an argument whether it's really about drinking or getting yourself to sleep. It doesn't matter. The difference between evil and good, it actually does matter, but we have to have a whole nother hour for that analysis. I have an analysis of that, but we don't have it. But the 4th one, it's actually not the 4th one in the listing, but it's the 4th one for today's sake, is matanot le'evyonim, which means gifts to the poor. And I've been one to say in the last few weeks that I think this is the most important mitzvah, the most important commandment that's linked to this book, in that when you see a world that is unjust, your job is to go out in the world and do something to make it different. So what do? We look at homelessness and suffering and people that are unhoused, and we go out and we do whatever it takes to make that person's life slightly more just in that moment. So I say to the people in my community, this is the moment where you should be writing checks to organizations that are working on housing and homelessness. I go out with my children. We walk Connecticut Avenue here in Washington, D.C., where there tends to be a number of homeless people, not this year because of COVID, but and we hand out bags of socks and deodorant and non-perishable food items. This idea that gifts to the poor is an essential part of the holiday reflects to me the notion that ultimately the Bible makes no real guarantees. The world is completely uncertain and upside down. You never know when things are going to get upended. Like last March, we thought things were fine. And then all of a sudden we weren't allowed back in our synagogues or our churches again. And what do you do in those moments? Instead of retreating fully, you put yourself into the injustice and you say, I can make a difference in this way. I might not be able to make the world make sense, the whole world, but in this way, I can go out in the world and make. So I can't just celebrate with my community. I have to actually go out and fix the problem of the injustice, which is ultimately what Esther did. And I think that really for me reflects fundamentally the religious message here, which is no matter where your faith is in that moment, no matter how much you believe in God, no matter how close you feel to God in that moment, for Jews, the turn for them in those moments is, can I still go out in the world and make a difference for what I believe is a world of tzedakah, the Hebrew word for justice and righteousness. And we do that on Purim because it ultimately reflects what Esther and Mordechai did in those moments of a world turned upside down.
Amen. We will end there. Thank you so much for being here today. I am
my pleasure.
And wish we had a few more hours.
Yes, someday we can have a whole day to talk about this stuff.
All right. Thank you,
Thanks
Elianna.
so much for having me.
We will catch you around. Take care.
Take care. Stay safe.